Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Diversity Professionals Group webinar hosted by Greater Cleveland Partnerships Equity and Inclusion Division. My name is Marcy Blue. I'm the Director of Research and Data Initiatives for GCP Equity and Inclusion, and I will be your moderator for today's session. On deck, we have a robust presentation with time for questions toward the end of our hour together. I would like to quickly provide brief introductions to our esteemed panelists who you will be hearing from today. They will dive more deeply into their roles and their work during their upcoming presentations. All of our panelists today are best in class and Hall of Fame winning organizations from 2020 as a result of their participation in the Equity and Inclusion Organization Assessment through GCP. And we're so happy to have them with us today. So first, I would like to welcome Melissa Burrows from the City of Cleveland. Melissa is the Director of the Office of Equal Opportunity. Welcome, Melissa, and thank you.
Thank you.
We also have Kevin Clayton on the line. Kevin is the Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement for the Cleveland Cavaliers Operating Company. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you,
Lastly,
Marcy.
we have Adrian Thompson, who is the co-partner in charge for Cleveland and the Chief Diversity Officer for Taft. Welcome and thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
So I'd like to just thank the panel for sharing their expertise with us today. I do have a few items of housekeeping to note before we jump into our agenda. First of all, you can always add any questions that come up for you in the questions box in your GoToWebinar screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can at the end of our program. We will also be adding a link to our post-event survey in the chat for the entire group. If you could take 1 to 2 minutes at the end of the program today to enter your info into the survey and let us know how we're doing, we would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, all of the slides from today's presentation and a video of today's webinar will be shared via email after the program ends, so you will have access to all of this information later on. So I'm going to jump right into our agenda. Firstly, I will be covering our Equity and Inclusion Organization Assessment and giving a brief overview of our assessment tool for those of you who may be less familiar with it. Then we will get into our panelist presentations from all of our best-in-class and Hall of Fame winners on the line. Lastly, we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end of the program, and then I will wrap us up at the end of the hour. So to get started, I wanted to introduce you to the Equity and Inclusion Organization Assessment through GCP. Our division has been collecting this data and reporting on the status of D&I in Northeast Ohio for almost 2 decades now through our organization assessment. And this assessment is a tool both for data collection and strategic planning around diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are a couple types of data that we're collecting in this survey, both on the quantitative side and the qualitative side. For the qualitative data, we're looking at employees in the workforce by race and gender. We also look at industry-specific level demographics. So for those industries that are structured a little bit differently than a typical for-profit, we're looking at healthcare, higher ed, law, and professional services data a little bit differently. And this year in 2021, we've introduced a new section on the IT workforce as well. The qualitative piece of the survey is around best practices. So we have adapted our best practice section of the assessment around the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks structure. This is a 14 category framework and a global model around best practices in equity and inclusion. And we believe it's the leading standard in this area. So as you can see on the screen, there are different categories around internal D&I, external D&I, those that bridge, and those that set the foundation for an organization. And all of these areas are key to bringing equity and inclusion into the organization. So this is the basic structure of the assessment and the types of data that organizations who participate are reporting back to us. I wanted to go over a couple of highlights from last year's assessment before we get into our presentations. We had a record number of 158 companies participating in 2020, representing close to 200,000 employees in Northeast Ohio alone. Because of COVID and everything that was happening in 2020 with racial injustice, we did extend the timeline of our data collection and we were able to bring more companies to the table. Because of that, we had some great companies showing up in different ways. So small companies really showed up in their participation. 46% of our total participating organizations were small companies. And we believe this is great because we want small companies, in addition to the large and mid-size, to be on a path toward equity and inclusion for their employees. We were also able to identify some upward trends in diversity at the board and senior management level from our previous year's data collection from 2018. And because our pool is getting bigger and bigger, we're very encouraged that these trends are continuing to move in an upward way for that leadership diversity area. In addition to the quantitative results, we were also encouraged by the best practices results, and we used those results to drive our programming in the Equity and Inclusion Division. For example, the program you're attending today is around assessments and measurements, which was one of the lower performing best practice categories from last year's data. So we're using those results to inform our programming for the year and bring about topics that maybe organizations are less familiar with. So we're hoping to continue to do that as we collect more data from our companies to see where are those areas of gaps and how can we help meet those needs. In 2020, we were also able to forge new partnerships to bring the assessment to new audiences. One was the Workforce Connect sector partnerships in Cuyahoga County. We've worked closely with the manufacturing leadership team in sector partnerships. We're going to continue that relationship for the next couple of years, and we've also started to build that relationship with the IT sector partnership as well. And as many of you will see in the 2021 survey, we've incorporated that IT workforce demographic piece for that group so that we can continue to work with those sector partnerships moving forward and bring equity and inclusion into their work. We've also been able to partner with other chambers and regions. Last year, we forged a partnership with the Greater Akron Chamber. We were able to bring many companies from the Akron area into our data collection and expose them to the survey tool. We're going to continue that relationship this year and replicate that with other counties in our region. So what's new for the assessment in 2021? Well, as I mentioned, 2020 brought about a lot of changes, specifically with our timeline. So we're going to keep the assessment available to organizations who are interested year-round. Because of that, we will have more timely results in aggregate reporting from our end as we're reporting back to those companies and back to the community at large on what the status of equity and inclusion is for these companies. We're also implementing a new deliverable, which is office hours consulting appointments with the equity and inclusion team so that an organization can review their results, can dive into topics that they're interested in, or if they're not familiar or they're just getting started, we can help them start down the road of their DEI journey. So there are some frequently asked questions that come up around the assessment for organizations who might be less familiar, so I wanted to cover some of those quickly. Once the data is compiled and in front of you, just entering it into the survey takes about 30 minutes. However, that is definitely not the only way that you can enter the data. There is a confidential link and password that comes with the assessment, and all of your data is saved based on that password. It's saved as you go. You can always close out and come back to the assessment tool later. You can also share that link and password with your colleagues who work in different departments and might have those different pieces of data that are needed. All submissions are confidential. Again, that link and password is confidential to your company. I'm the only one seeing the data on our end, so we keep the data confidential. Anything that's in the aggregate is reported out, never linked to a company's name. We also have some immediate results for you once you complete your assessment. So once you hit submit on the assessment tool, you are able to see your best practices scores immediately. You're also able to save those scores along with your full submission upon completing the survey, taking those materials with you to start building out your internal D&I strategies. And lastly, I wanted to cover some of the things that might come up once a company has completed the assessment. Sometimes we hear, okay, I've gone through, I've collected this data, I've submitted it, now what do we do? So as you can see in this little flow chart, we've provided the tools of the assessment, and the submission itself is the beginning of that journey. So we have the tool, we do the data collection, and we do the analysis. What we're reporting back to you is the individual results of your company, the aggregate results of the entire group of submissions, and also those things like your best practice scores. However, we also are constantly connecting you to our other resources. So the first would be the best practice library. And the way that we've structured this free online repository is directly around the assessment best practice categories. So if a company has completed their assessment and they see that one of the categories may be around DEI, vision, and leadership, they didn't score as highly as they thought they wanted to or that they should have, but they want to really dig into that and see why and see what else they might be doing. They can click right into our best practice library, go right to that section, and find all of the resources, research, articles, toolkits that our team has collected and put in place. We're keeping that as up to date as possible with the most current, most relevant information. We also have a breadth of programming within our division that I won't dive into today, but this program that you're attending today is an example of that. So we hold quarterly sessions for diversity professionals and others who are interested in working in this area. We hold quarterly sessions specifically on procurement and supplier diversity. We hold our annual inclusion conference every August where we bring together experts in the field, in addition to a multitude of other programs and work. So we're constantly connecting organizations to that work where appropriate for their companies. And lastly, as I mentioned, we're implementing new deliverables around the assessment constantly. The first one this year being office hours and consulting appointments with our team. And we're hoping that that one-on-one conversations around either your results or another topic that is influential to your organization will be helpful to move you down the path of equity and inclusion. So all in all, our ultimate goal with this assessment tool is really to spark the light, turn on the light bulb, get the awareness raised to say, hey, this is something we should be thinking about. This is something we should be doing. What do we do next? Get those wheels turning both for leadership and staff, and then help you to find the pieces and parts that lead to you building out the playbook for your organization. It is incredibly individual to each company, so we want to make sure that we're providing the best resources up front to help your teams move forward in this space. So with that, I'm going to pause and kick it over to Melissa to talk about how the City of Cleveland has used the assessment tool for their work.
Thank you, Marcy. Good morning, everyone. Marcy, I guess I'll just say turn, I guess, when I'm ready. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for being able to participate on this panel. I will say to you, even before my time here with the City of Cleveland, that the actual survey or assessment has either followed me around or I have followed that assessment around, because each of the organizations that I've worked at, I've been part of completing the assessment. The assessment becomes a tool, not just to complete and fill out, but it becomes a tool in which you can benchmark your organization against others, but most importantly, it becomes a tool that you can use to make your organization better. And with that, can you please turn for me? So here in the City of Cleveland, as you may know, the mayor has this philosophy of self-help. And really, our assessment piece has really been around that particular philosophy and the mayor's whole entire diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. I'm also going to just talk a little bit about how the city has talked about racism and declared racism as a public health crisis. The next one is really how we have positioned Cleveland residents and businesses for this long-term success. And then finally, how we can sort of build this bandwidth for contracting. Next slide, please. So when you hear the mayor talk about this self-help philosophy, it really is around that we, the City of Cleveland, we will invest locally, buy locally, and then hire locally. And really the goal behind any of that is so that we can sustain our Cleveland economy. And really through this self-help initiative and more philosophy, the city can create these pathways for really ensuring a prosperous regional economy, really in which all of Clevelanders can benefit. We know that if the city is not in a position to assist others, then the whole economy of this region can suffer. Next slide, please. You know, or may have heard that last year it became an important initiative really through Cleveland City Council. And on June 3rd of 2020, Cleveland City Council declared racism as a public health crisis. We know that at the time last year, our entire nation was suffering, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to all of the things that occurred related to racism. And then on top of everything else, then there was the whole piece around COVID, and an entire health crisis as well. And so part of that particular initiative in terms of declaring racism as a public health crisis, the whole initiative was launched really to tackle inequities within our system. We know that there are inequities throughout all types and all levels throughout our nation, and even within our health industry as well. And so we began setting that stage for the city really to tackle disparities that have led to this poor health outcome for African Americans in Cleveland. We've heard some of those statistics. We know that there are some things in which more work needs to be done, but really through our partnerships with various organizations, from working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the city really is taking a task and trying to eliminate disparities causing these health initiatives or health issues. I will say to you, some of these initiatives really around, it's almost to some extent can be known as a crisis, but there are generational disparities in education, in terms of access to jobs. There are issues around that. The whole notion around empowering the earning power of individuals and people of color, that's another issue. Access to housing, and then even as the reason why we are looking at this public health crisis is really even access to health care has become an issue as well. And so this is the time, based on our nation's status last year, for us to pay attention and really figure out how we can tackle that today. Next slide. When we talk about trying to position the city for longer term success, there are two areas or two broad categories and tactics in which we're trying to assist our residents and businesses, really to assist them with their more immediate needs and position our businesses and residents for a longer term success. One is really trying to continue to implement and limit the spread, obviously, of the virus. You always hear the mayor speak, in terms of making sure that we wash our hands, that we stay inside as much as possible, and then also the fact that we stay apart from each other. And when we say that, that means from a physical presence. There are other ways that we can actually measure and assist, and more importantly, stay in contact with each other. And then finally, another issue or concern and where we need to focus is mitigating this short-term social and economic impacts of the virus. And really, as we put that into practice, the city has multiple programs and policies and efforts to support each other. Again, it's these policies and decisions directly are under control of the city of Cleveland, as well as how we can allocate funds obtained through the initial Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. So we're spending our time as we gain resources from the national level and really focusing in on our Cleveland residents and our economy and our contractors and all of those that we can impact and assisting them as it relates to us, mitigating the impact of the virus. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk just a little bit about one of the ways that we're able to sort of build the bandwidth for contracting. We know that contractors, and when I say contractors, businesses are suffering due to the fact that the virus is impacting their business. People are now having to stay inside. They're not potentially able to go out and support our businesses. And so one of the things that we started on an initiative, I think I would say at this point about 1.5 years, was looking at one of our particular city ordinances, and that is the small contract rotation program. We had an ordinance on the books, but we never really implemented that ordinance. And so we took the ordinance and added some language, amended the legislation. And then as a result of that, the focus has been on how we can support our local contractors through a rotation process. In other words, those small contractors, and for the city of Cleveland, we're naming them very small contractors. So contractors that make less than $3 million over a 3-year period, we're assisting those contractors. Last year, we took those contractors and put them through a process where they had learning opportunities. There were about 8 classes that were designed around assisting our smaller contractors, from classes on estimating to marketing, to government agencies, to even understanding your own individual budgets. Those kind of classes based on a survey that we took with our contractors. We actually were able to take that survey and tailor that survey based on the need and have classes around that. Now that we've had the classes and the contractors have gone through those classes, now we're in the pilot phase of the program where we are taking those small contractors and giving them opportunities to work within the city of Cleveland through our renovation of our rec centers. Next slide, please. I can't believe that I'm done. So those are just some of the highlights. Let me say, just as I turn it over to Kevin, that the survey really is a document, and the assessment is a piece that you take internally, and you can gain information about your particular organization so that you can make it a best practice organization as well. So with that, I will say thank you, and I think it's potentially my job to turn it on over to Kevin Clayton.
I will make Kevin the presenter now.
Good morning. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
You can see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. I'm going to take a few moments to walk you through the Cavalier story. And when people kind of hear about me working for the Cavs, they only think about our team, the basketball team. But I'm responsible for Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, our hockey team, the Cleveland Monsters, our G League team, the Canton Charge, and our esports team, the Cavs Legion. So it's all of those properties. And I'm going to do this in a...
Kevin?
Yes.
Just a sec. Can you move the GoToWebinar? Yes, thank you. That way everybody can see your slides. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep, we're good to go.
All right. Okay, how's that?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to do this by giving you a historical background as to how I have come about using assessments, and I'll connect the dots between the GCP assessment. So from a background standpoint, I've been in this role now for 18 months with the Cavs, and my background started years ago with Procter & Gamble. And I share that because the story, and yes, this is me right here selling toilet tissue and all those things with a guy named Mr. Whipple and all of that. But I wanted to share this story with you because my first introduction to diversity to begin with came from my days of P&G. P&G uses data for everything. So we had just come from a meeting where John Pepper, our CEO, had talked about, hey, we're going to introduce diversity as a business strategy. And I was fascinated by that. And I was fascinated to the point where, as I'm coming back from this meeting, one of my colleagues, his name is Jeff. Jeff is a white male, and he's saying, Kevin, look, I don't really know why this is a big deal. I don't even know why this is exciting. And I'm looking at him and I'm saying, wow, okay, Jeff, he's a white male, as I said. You must be, in my mind, I'm like, you must be racist, or I mean, what's going on? So I asked him why. And he said, Kevin, if this is diversity for the sake of diversity, then I have really no interest in doing anything different than what I've been doing. But if this is diversity where you can show me how I'm going to sell more Charmin, more White Cloud, more Tide, more Pampers, more Loves, I'm all in. So that really was the aha moment for me. And what I realized was, one, I had to answer the question of what's in it for me from an organizational standpoint. Two, I had to use the same language that we were using. It had to be database. I had to have metrics. And lastly, there had to be business imperative. So I say that because my grounding in using data in assessment comes from a business perspective, not an HR perspective. So what have we done? So when I came on board with the Cavs, I was able to basically inherit a great track record of success that the Cavs had had in Cleveland. We had these different event nights, and we had these community activities that were really well known in Cleveland. Our senior leadership had buy-in. There was organizational support. In the NBA, the Cavaliers are considered best in class as it relates to the number of people of color that are at the different executive positions, as well as some of the supplier diversity work that we're doing. And then lastly, there was recognition from the GCP of the work that the Cavs were doing. So this is what I inherited, a great running start, but I will tell you what the difference was. Those were all one-off activities. They were lots of different activities and things going on that weren't necessarily embedded into a strategic platform. So what I was able to do was to do an internal assessment, and using what a armchair audit is when you take a look at all the data that's out there. I took a look at the GCP assessment information from the previous years. We did interviews, I did focus groups, I did internal assessments from the NBA. I looked at fan information. So I pulled all of this together to build a strategic plan. And I share that with you because the GCP assessment that we're referencing is one of the key tools that we use to build a plan. And it should not be the only thing you use, because it should complement the other things internally that you're doing. So we took that data and we took a look at 5 different areas based on the common themes out of the assessments. One was that we realized that there was feedback from a team member standpoint. I told you the NBA had recognized the Cavs as being best in class around what we look like at the top of the house. However, when you went down to mid-management, we found that we did not have the representation that actually was equivalent to the community in which we serve. So our aspiration was that our team members were going to mirror the demographics of the communities that we live and worked in. From a culture standpoint, what the assessment information told us is that we didn't have the most inclusive culture where everyone was actually treated with dignity and respect. So our aspiration was, how do we go ahead, how do we create that? Lastly, from a fan development standpoint, what we took a look at was all of our fans to understand who our fans were. And what we identified was, as analytical as the NBA and professional sports are, we did not know at a granular level what all of our fans really thought based on demographics about the product that they were seeing, either from a Cavs standpoint, a concert at Rocky Mortgage Fieldhouse, or from our hockey team. So we wanted to make sure that the only way we can provide an equitable experience for all our fans is to understand who our fans were. From a marketplace standpoint, what we realized was that we had to create a fair and equitable culture by leveraging diversity and inclusion to increase revenue and create and strengthen partnerships. And then lastly, from a community perspective, our aspiration was that we were relevant and trusted, engaged with all communities. So these strategic areas, which they're not pillars because I can't do one without the other, all came from assessment information, and the GCP assessment was a huge part of that. So we took the data, we implemented it into a strategic platform, and I'm just going to do a high-level overview of what that might look like as we now connect it back to metrics. So as I mentioned around our team members, what our aspiration was. One of our specific strategies was to ensure that all of our initial interview slates reflected demographics of our targeted communities. You heard probably of the Rooney Rule. Ours is the rule of 3, and that says for any interview slate that we have, our initial interview slate or follow-up or what have you, you have to start with 3 individuals that represent different dimensions of diversity, which is different than the Rooney Rule, which says you just need 1. Our metric was that our team member representation, and we call our employees team members, equaled the population based on the communities in which we serve. I talked about the culture and what we wanted to do. One of the things when you start thinking about systemic racism inside corporations or in organizations, what that looks like when you say that, it's taking a look at the systems that drive the culture. Your compensation system, promotion system, game plans, those are our performance reviews, feedback, and what have you. If they're not equitable across all groups of people, then that is where you have either systemic racism, systemic homophobia, systemic gender issues. So ours was taking a look at our systems, and then how do we close the gap? The metric was, how do we close the gap across all demographic groups? I mentioned our fan development process. So we have a business intelligence group that is now developing a baseline across all of our properties to make sure that our fan base is equal to the global NBA demographics. And then what we're doing is drilling that down to say, in Cleveland, in Canton, in areas, is our fan base equivalent to that, so that we can make sure that we are creating the kind of experience for all of our fans, not just looking at an aggregate number and saying, well, everybody likes hockey, everybody likes basketball. We wanted to drill down to make sure the experience was equivalent for everybody. I talked about the marketplace and making sure our strategy was create and implement D&I strategic partnerships, that a partnership model for our current and future partners. Our metric around this, and this is very important, is that it ties the number of partners that we have to make sure that they have a D&I activation. What you see is, actually, this is a conversation that we did at the GCP conference last year with our female head coach, Coach Gottlieb, and then we did a partnership with UPS. It's called Business and Basketball. Each one of our partners, we're making sure there's a D&I activation. And lastly, from a community standpoint, we realized we had good relationships in the community, but we didn't have authentic relationships. So what that means is we wanted to drill down even further. And we identified the LGBTQ community, Latinx community, and others. We picked 4 communities to say, okay, year one, we want to make sure the number of community engagements by targeted communities was the metric. Some of these are process metrics, and then some of these actually begin to take a look at it from a numerical standpoint. Lastly, and this is, I'm really proud that Melissa is on board with this, because we have a very aggressive supplier diversity strategy as well. And when we actually did the transformation for the field house, that was a $200 million project. And we, in partnership with, and as Melissa said, self-help. That's something they implemented with, look, if this is a public-private partnership, that there are certain requirements and goals that the city and the county had for us. And we have, and what you see on the top right-hand side, from a workforce right-hand side, there's a workforce participation metric of percent of minority workforce, women, the county, the city, low income, and then you see the actual the actual goals in which we exceeded on almost every one of these. And then you can take a look at the number of hours. Everything on here is a report that was submitted into the city. And I'm proud to say that the vendors or the contractors, 59% of our contractors represented some dimension of diversity outside of majority companies. So I told you there were aha moments that I had back in the day when I started with P&G. For us, with the Cavs, the what's in it for me, DE&I is tied to performance and compensation and bonus. The language, it's a core value. We use the assessment as our database. We have a scorecard that we're looking at the metrics, some of the metrics I shared with you. And also it's a business imperative. This is tied into the business plans or the game plans that we call our performance development for each one of our team members. So with that, I will turn the control back over, and thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to pull up Adrian's slides now.
Are we ready?
We're ready.
All right. Good morning. I'd like to thank GCP, Melissa, and Kevin for giving Taft the opportunity to share our journey in, we say, inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, and diversity. Although the history of law firms and the legal profession in general has been very resistant to change, and Taft has really been no different. Please, next slide, please. So when I began working at Taft in 2006, the focus was on numbers. The focus was on diversity as a moral imperative and bringing in people of color. The focus was not on retention. So, you know, we brought people in, we lost people. I'll give you an example. When I started in 2006, 2 months later, they made me the head of the diversity committee. I really knew nothing about Taft. In 2006, the focus was on making certain that we had seats at the table at events, at women's events, events for African-American lawyers, Hispanic lawyers, and even some LGBTQ events. But that was a focus on diversity at Taft. That began to change because we were losing our people. We were losing people of color. We were losing African American and Hispanic males after 3 years. We were losing African American and Hispanic females after 5 years. And white females were leaving Taft after 7 years. So we knew there was a problem. So what we did in 2015 as part of our strategic plan, there was a reemphasis and a focus on diversity and inclusion. So the first thing we did is that we retooled our diversity and inclusion committee. And we knew we had to focus on retention. So we created a mentor champion program. And there was a lot of discussion about who would be involved in the mentor champion program because the question was, did we include white males or did we include historically underrepresented groups? And at that time, there was a lot of discussion. It wasn't heated, but it was open discussion. And we said we had to create systemic solution for systemic problems. The historic underrepresentation of those groups was because of racism and other factors, going back to high school, going back to the public school system. So what we did is we created a team of mentors and champions that focused on creating a blueprint for success for our historically underrepresented attorneys. Next slide, please. We use the GCP Equity and Inclusion Organizational Assessment to guide and refine our programs. I started 15 years ago, and I've been using the assessment for 15 years. And it really opened our eyes in many ways, as far as supplier diversity, but also opportunities for our historically underrepresented attorneys. Next slide, please. We understand now that inclusion and equity is what matters. Like Kevin said, diversity alone is just a numbers game. If you have diversity only, your people are going to leave. So we had to create an environment where all of our attorneys, all of our staff felt that they had a real chance to succeed at Taft. And we did that in a number of ways. We have open forums, we have open discussions. We look at data. We look at what our attorneys are doing. We look at our work teams. And we do things like that just to make certain that everyone has a real opportunity. And it sounds hokey, but that's what we have to do. Our clients are demanding not only diversity, but they're demanding they look at our numbers. They're actually looking at our time for each individual timekeeper. They want to see the makeup of our team because we know now, and our clients knew before us, that diverse teams provide the best results. It's diverse teams with an inclusive environment that produces sustainable solutions for our clients, both today and tomorrow. But it also means that we continue to have a team that, a diverse team that is a very inclusive team that feels a part of Taft. Next slide, please. Again, we had our executive committee met, and again in 2015 we created the Taft Work Plan for Diversity and Inclusion. Right now we have at least 25 attorneys and senior staff who meet monthly and look at our diversity and inclusion efforts. We look at our numbers, the attorney numbers every month to make certain that there are no outliers. And if there are outliers, we ask the questions why. We ask our practice group leaders, why compared to Adrian's comparators, why are his numbers down? And we demand results. Our compensation system takes diversity and inclusion into consideration. Not so much the numbers, but the actual data and the results. If we create an inclusive environment, young, historically underrepresented attorneys will come to Taft. And that's happened over time. But EI&D reflects our core values. And our key core value is to create an atmosphere where every attorney, every staff member can bring their authentic self to work to be a part of an inclusive team. And it's taken time. Like I said, law firms have been very resistant to change, and Taft has been no different. We have attorneys and we have staff members who have not embraced what we do. But one thing we can do is we can change conduct. We may not be able to change attitudes, but people feel, a crunch in their pocketbook because they don't act like a Taft team member, and that happens. And that's what we focus on. Next slide, please. One thing we had to do is we had to understand where we were on our inclusion, equity, and diversity journey. And one thing we had to deal with as a firm is we had to understand the pitfalls or the barriers to inclusion. And we all have biases. You know, I tell this story to my colleagues all the time. I grew up on the wrong side of the tracks with poor and working class white kids and poor and working class Latino kids. And we were jealous, or we always had antipathy against kids from the other side of the tracks. And I carried that with me for the last 30 to 40 years, and I carried that with me to Taft. And I'll give you an example. I'm on the personnel committee that actually hires staff members and hires attorneys into Taft. And my colleagues would tell me, Adrian, if we brought in two attorneys who had potential attorneys who had similar comparators, if they had similar grades, if there were some similar schools, you always chose the underdog. So that was a bias I carried with me. Kids from the other side of the tracks, my colleagues who went to Ivy League schools, who went to private prep schools, they told me I had a bias, and it's true. And they had biases too. So we had to understand what our biases were, and we brought in Dr. Erin Reeves, and she actually sat down with us. She provided training to all of our offices, all of our staff, and all of our attorneys on what implicit or unconscious bias was. And that training actually helped us have open discussions on how we could be more inclusive. Next slide, please. We also, for the first time in 2019, we held a retreat, and the retreat was for the historically underrepresented attorneys of color, our practice group leaders in all of our offices, our executive committee, and our partners in charge in each office. And the purpose of that was just to have a meaningful, open discussion, to have relationship building. Because being an attorney of color in a large law firm can be very lonely at times because you're one of few. Even at Taft, we have approximately over 650 attorneys. We have less than 100 attorneys of color. We may have 6 or 7 attorneys in each of our offices, but it can be lonely. So we thought it was necessary to bring as many of our attorneys of color and our leadership group together and just have an open discussion about what it meant to be an attorney of color, the biases that still exist at Taft, how we address the biases. The other thing we did, we brought in some of our largest clients to engage us in what they expected us to do to be an inclusive environment. We also had individual meetings with our attorneys of color, where we just shared open discussions. If they had issues in their office, we addressed those issues with the practice group leaders. The other thing we did, we celebrated the accomplishments that we made today. We're not where we want to be, but we're working toward being the inclusive employer of choice in each of our market. The other thing we did on that Saturday, we think this is very important for Taft to establish relationships in the communities where we work and live. We actually had a session where we met with different organizations from the community. We met with the NAACP and other organizations, and we actually held workshops for the different groups. Next slide, please. After the death of Mr. Floyd, after he was killed, we knew we had to amplify our efforts and refocus our efforts. So what we did, we focused more on the data, and that we put together an implementation task force, and we have 3 pillars. But the key pillar was, number 1, practicing what we preach. We looked at the data. We looked at the data for all of our attorneys, but we focused on our female attorneys, our self-identified members of the LGBT community, our historically underrepresented attorneys of color, and our self-identifying attorneys who have physical and mental limitations. And we compared their numbers to their comparators. And again, we asked the question, why? And we sat down with our practice group leaders. We met as executive committee, and our managing partner led that discussion. And we, at this point, we're looking at how we can rectify issues that did exist. And we did have some issues that did exist, but we're trying to rectify those issues. The other thing, the two other pillars, we have a pillar that talks about speaking with clarity. It's important how you communicate with your colleagues and within your organization. So Dr. Reeves continues to work with us so we speak with clarity. And if there are issues between any of our team members, we try to bring those team members together and have open and authentic conversations about the issues that divide us. But the other thing we do is that, again, supporting our clients and our community is very important that we as an organization work closely in the communities where we work and live. The other thing we're doing, we're redefining our Mentor Champion program that I talked about previously. In 2015, we had a Mentor Champion program. We had 15 associates, and we had 15 Mentor Champions. The associates were from the historically underrepresented groups. Our champions were partners who had the ability to make change on behalf of those historically underrepresented associates. The problem was that not all the champions and the mentors really meshed. So we worked with Dr. Reeves and we created a new program, a revised program of our pilot program, where we're going to have 25 mentor champions, but it's going to be a panel of champions. And those champions will be selected by members of staff, all the attorneys in the office, the executive committee, and the partners in charge through nomination process. And the executive committee, the managing partner, and members of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee will come together and select those champions. And the mentees will be first, second, and third year associates from historically underrepresented groups. And like I said before, there's discussion on why white males aren't included in the group, because right now white males have a critical mass. Not to say we don't continue to recruit white males, but right now white males are the majority of who we are as a law firm. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we need to continue to create a critical mass of women associates and partner leaders, historically underrepresented groups, African American, Hispanic, Latino attorneys, attorneys with disabilities, and members of our LGBTQ community. So that's what we're doing. Next slide, please. The other thing we did is that we knew after Mr. Floyd's killing, we had to create an environment where we could talk about issues that were affecting the nation, but also affecting us as individuals. So we participated in the ABA 21-day racial equity habit building challenge. And what it was a series of books and readings and YouTube presentations that we invited all staff members and all attorneys in our organization firm-wide to read. And on Thursdays and Fridays, we held Zoom meetings where we had moderators, but we just had open discussions and open conversation about the meaning of the information we read. We're also a Mansfield Certified Plus status. The Mansfield Rule is a national initiative really designed to give women and people of color in law firms opportunities to be in leadership positions. And we're Mansfield Certified Plus because of our data and because of what we're doing as an organization. We're a 3-time winner of Best of Class Awards in Diversity and Inclusion, but that's because of the guidance we received from the partnership and from Aaron Reeves and just trying to do the right thing. And I'll say this about our inclusion and equity efforts: they really won't work unless your leadership gets it. The drive has to start from the top. Your leaders in your organizations have to really embrace inclusion for this to work. And in most major law firms, large law firms, the majority that leads the law firm are white males. So you have to get that buy-in from white males to make them not feel like you're attacking them, not the victim. But in the long run, it's in the best long-term interest for the firm, for your clients and the community, to be an inclusive organization. Next slide, please. And we also joined the Law Firm Racial Alliance, and I'm not going to go through these, but these are things we do to make certain that each staff member has a real opportunity to participate and feel included in what we're doing. We're really ramping up our pro bono efforts in each of our communities to make certain we're serving our communities. Because if you don't serve the communities and if you don't embrace the communities and don't become a part of the community, then you're not truly an inclusive organization. Next slide, please. Again, the organization has to fully endorse each group within the organization, the diverse groups, and all attorneys. So we support all groups within our organization. Next slide, please. Strength lies in differences, not in similarities, and we truly believe that. I know that was rushed, but I needed to get through this slide so we continue our conversation. Thanks a lot, and I'm turning it back over.
Thank you all. This was such great information, and I want to make sure that we have time to answer at least a question or two before we wrap up today. So I'm going to start us off with a question around the organizational assessment or other assessments that your organization has used. And if you have any recommendations or strategies on how that information can be shared internally, whether it's with staff or leadership, and how you've been able to do that successfully. And I will kick it to Melissa to start us off with this question.
Thank you, Marcy. I definitely appreciate all the comments, and Adrian, I agree, and even Kevin, from the perspective that diversity has to be agreed and channeled from the top of the house all the way down. So when the mayor tells us, you know, diversity and inclusion are important, we buy into it. But the way that you really take diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts is the fact that you have to be able to internalize it and figure out a way in which you as an organization can use it. Let me just give you an example. So last year, maybe 2 years ago now, we knew that we wanted, the city of Cleveland, we wanted our cabinet members and other so commissioners and others, to participate in the racial equity training through Neighborhood Progress, Inc. And we knew that just based on the fact that if we could have individuals at the top of the house understand diversity and inclusion as managers, they would be able to take that information and internalize it to the work that they're doing. And then subsequently, then others within the organization could use it as well. So I would say being able to internalize it, understand it, and really bottom line, how will it impact your business? And obviously from a corporate perspective, my partners can talk about that, but it really, at times it gets down to that shareholder value. So what do the shareholders value, and what's the business case, and why are we doing this?
Yeah, hey Marcy, the one thing that I would add is, and I said it during my conversation, the assessment is one of the tools. And because it is a quantitative tool, you want to supplement that with doing focus groups, interviews, and things of that nature. So you have the qualitative and quantitative to understand what people really think about the data. So one of the things in which we have done, we take the data from the assessment and we share it with our organization in small groups, have them give us feedback around that so that we can build it out at a micro level instead of a macro level.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would just say once you have the assessment, you have to have an action plan. You can't have an assessment and don't open the, share your results with your personnel, but you also have to, once you get the assessment, you have to have a plan of action to put the assessment in place and then move forward.
Great, thank you. We did have a question from the audience, and I just wanted to make sure we were able to cover that quickly if possible. Around supplier diversity, I know many of you mentioned this, specifically Melissa and Kevin. Do you have any goals or quotas set up that you must meet to purchase from diverse suppliers? And how do you handle your supplier diversity programs around data in that way? If we have a quick, 1-minute overview that we can get for this question, that would be great. And then to Carol, who asked the question, we can always follow up with more details later on.
Yes, so the answer is yes, and that's why I shared with you what we had in agreement with the city. And we do have targets, and it is connected into, for us, anybody who buys something as simple as a piece of paper has a target around doing business with minority and women-owned companies and others. But yes, we do have a supplier diversity goal.
Ditto. So based on our ordinances, and based on various disparity studies, we have goals and requirements on our contracts, and we can provide more information later about that.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I see that we only have 2 minutes left, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one more time while we wrap up. So I want to thank all of our speakers today for joining us. We are so grateful for you for sharing your expertise. And again, to all of our attendees, we will be sharing our slide deck and a recording of this webinar today with all of you in a follow-up email. If you could please fill out our program survey, it is linked in the chat box. It should only take you a minute or two, and we will definitely be using that feedback to inform our future programming. Our division has a couple of upcoming events. We have our Ignite Racial Equity Series winter cohort starting up February 19th. If you are interested in this, we can get you more information. We also have a procurement professionals group similar to this group focused on supplier diversity on March 10th. So definitely save the date for that and look out for the registration coming soon. If any of you want more information on our equity and inclusion organization assessment or a status update for your organization to see if you're already participating, please shoot me an email. My email is up here on the screen, and I'd be happy to get that information to you. We also have a submission box on our GCP Equity and Inclusion webpage for more information if you'd prefer to visit it that way. So once again, thank you to our panel for joining us today, and thank you to all of you for attending. We greatly appreciate your engagement today. So thank you. And with that, I will close us out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.